I had a loopmaker email me a Michael Jackson song and say that this was an original sample they created and then asked for a 50-50 split on any placements. This is why I have trust issues. Now, even when a loopmaker is sending original music, I'm still a little nervous if I don't know how they do business, because what if they're greedy or what if they're inexperienced and they think it's normal to charge a sample clearance fee or, something that defeats the entire purpose of me using their loop, right? Now, there was some producer drama going on. I don't know how I missed it initially, but evidently it had to do with Future's latest album where a loopmaker wanted $15,000 for use of his loop, and it sounded like there was some miscommunication going on. We tried to get to the bottom of it with Ryan Schmidt, who's a music attorney. We discuss a lot on that episode. I'll drop a link to the full episode in the description. But what's your opinion on this? Are loop makers getting a little too greedy, or are producers, especially bigger producers who are getting placements, are they undervaluing loop makers? Are we all just undervaluing each other? Crazy times we live in, but I appreciate you watching this. Thank you.
We're in a new era of beat making where now there's a kind of a separate category of musicians called sample makers, loop makers. I kind of became one by accident. So in this case, you have a sample maker who is airing out a situation that they had where they were offered 5% publishing. So two sample makers came together, made a sample, got a placement with it. And it's unclear, as these things generally are, and I wish they were clearer. But he says, I was told to take 5% publishing for us to split, or else the producer who placed the beat would swap out the sample. So it sounds as though the label probably wasn't the one having this conversation. It was probably like the producer's manager or the producer's lawyer telling the sample maker this, because otherwise I don't think the label cares who gets split as long as they retain their money. And they labels generally don't care that much about publishing because they get their money off the artist, not the producers publishing. So this is already kind of weird, but it sounds as though, and this is I say this all the time, this is how the industry works. They just drop the song anyway. It looks like the advance was 7.5% of the total budget to split, which is again unclear. The total budget for the song, the total budget for the album. What are we talking about? Here are the parts that stuck out. The loopmaker says, I'm not saying everything has to be completely equal all the time, but with 20 plus placements in my catalog, 5% publishing and an advance that barely covers lawyer fees isn't going to work for producing 50% of the record. They said the relationship was over and that's okay. I decided that for myself a while back. Why would I want to have a relationship with someone who doesn't want me to get paid? I say that all the time. For all the up-and-coming producers, I want to make it clear that this story is not representative of the entire industry. There are plenty of producers out here doing fair business. Just work it out with them. So it does sound like this whole legal battle was not with a record label, but with a producer who used a loop, got it placed, and now the producer is trying to give the loop makers a far lower split than what they think is standard.
Yeah, and this is a great reason to have these conversations ahead of time. And I know you, Payne, you're talking about your terms and conditions. It's really risky to just send out loops or beats or anything without at least some type of conversation about what your expectation would be if somebody were to use it. And I see producers and loop makers do it all the time where they just send out beats to everybody and they don't even talk about splits. And of course, legally, they still retain that copyright, but now you're leaving a lot open to negotiation down the road. And situations like this occur. I think, too, one thing that I saw here, the publishing part of it, that seems really low, a percentage of publishing, especially if they're asking the producers to split publishing. In labels, you're absolutely right. Labels do not care. Typically, unless we're talking about a 360 deal, they do not care who has the right or splits and anything like that because they're not monetizing that anyway. But my thought when I first saw the 5% and 7.5% is that's closer to producer points than typical publishing splits. And I was wondering if that wasn't even what they were all fighting about.
What would be fair, in your opinion, from you, Payne, and Ryan, like what in your, because he contributed a little. And Payne, you're gonna have to excuse my ignorance on like sometimes loops can be much bigger parts of songs than others, right? It's not always like, sometimes that could be like the main part of the song or like the most interesting piece of the song, and sometimes it can play maybe a smaller role. But from your perspective, like what without knowing or hearing the song, like what would be closer to fair?
Don't always agree with producers on this. I've done this just for the equity in the record. And I've also done it where I've gotten paid in advance and gotten equity. I think it just depends on how the sample is used. It depends on who we're working with, what they're willing to give up. I mean, when I've gotten, I'll put it this way. I've gotten placements with loops I've made and gotten, like there were 3 of us on the Pooh Shiesty record. I made the loop. I got a third of the advance and I got a third of the publishing, even split. They insisted. Gold Hayes and JD Feng are just good people and they wanted things to be split. Now, had they said, you know what, we're going to take the majority, we're going to give you 10%, that wouldn't make them bad people. I think that's still fair. They got the placement. It was a loop I had in a pack, so it's not like I really was invested in the project from the beginning. So that's all fine with me. I think for me, when I'm working with Loopmakers, I'm just assuming that we're going to do an even split. But I really want to know. My problem with Loopmakers is always that I just wake up, it's a new Loopmaker in my inbox sending me loops saying, hey, bro, love your shit. Here's some hot fire. Let's get some placements. It's like, let's get some. Who are you getting placements with? You're depending on us to get you placements, acting like I'm in LA right now surrounded by rap stars when really I'm just grinding harder than you are. And you're not telling me what your terms are. So if I get a placement with this, all of a sudden you're going to ask for a sample clearance fee or something ridiculous. And I'm going to regret ever working with you. So that's why I'm very closed off to working with new people. I kind of work, thankfully, with the talented Loopmakers around me that I've been through this shit with already. So I know where they stand. So I'm digging through the loop section, the comments section. I want to make beats. Shout out to Dreidel. DJ Dreidel says, I'm 99.9% sure I know it. I'm trying to piece things together. I guess this was a Future record. I think it was on the new Future mixtape. I think it was produced by Smat Certified. If I'm wrong, I'm so sorry. But Smat Certified is in the comments. And Dreidel says that the Loopmaker's leaving out a lot of information. He says, number one, he didn't produce 50% of the record. It was a loop and it just repeats itself throughout the song. The term produce 50% of the record is an effing stretch. Not only that, but he was invited to the session and decided to bring his producer homie who wasn't invited. So that's another split. So now two producers in the room and the loop had another producer on it. Now 3 producers on one loop. That's why it was 5%. So that kind of makes sense. I mean, if I'm asking for like 20%, that's vague because is it 20% of the overall 100% or is it 20% of what the producer's getting, which is 50%? In that case, I'd be splitting with my co-producer and that percentage would be closer to 5%. I still think 5% is low, but again, I wasn't there. Also to the producer from this post, if you see this, what I said isn't, I don't know what that means.
I think like people, I mean, obviously there really is no standard, right? Like no. It really just comes down to communication because even with what you said, it's kind of like I could see a Loopmaker having an issue potentially with how you originally set up like your splits, like saying, oh, let's split it evenly, right? Because a Loopmaker might be like, okay, now you got 3 other producers on it, so there's 4 of us splitting 50%. But then what if there was only 1 other producer? So now I get 25%, but I did the same work. So how are you like going up and down with my percentage? And I did the same work. It's you that keep adding more producers. So I could see how, just like a lot of other conversations in the music industry, this can get messy. So the communication just has to be on point. I think you definitely have to factor in the relationship and how you value that going forward. Because I think the way you do it makes a lot of sense for the relationship. Like, okay, hey, we're not even going to argue about this. We're splitting it even going forward. You love working with them. They love working with you. We keep it rocking. So I see how it just can become a complete shit show as well. It just goes back to what Ryan says, just about communicating up front and early before things, there's a bunch of money on the table or anything like that.
Well, let me ask you this too, because it sounded as though he was negotiating an advance from a team of producers. And according to the comments section, I saw this come up a lot. The Loopmaker asked for $15,000. So how does that change the conversation?
Sheesh.
Yeah, I mean that's high, and what the other producer said, that was higher than the overall budget and fee that the producers got. So you can't ask for more than anybody's getting. The money just doesn't exist. So that's one part there. But I think that if you agree on splits and that is understood from the beginning, then the advance really should be split in accordance with whatever that percentage was. I think that's usually the fairest way to go. But I think that between the percentages that were used, bringing friends to the studio, messing this whole thing up, and then airing out the dirty laundry, my guess is that this is somebody newer in the game, because it makes a lot more sense to treat this as an expensive lesson and hit them next time. Like next time I'll have that conversation. We'll get it all taken care of. We're going to make 1 million songs together. It's good to go. This guy just didn't choose to do that.
Well, that brings up another narrative that I hear, and it's more of just an expectation that producers who aren't necessarily in the music business have. What would you say for a major label project? What can producers expect as an advance? Well, like a range?
If we're talking about a major placement, I've seen as low as 500 for a song, and I've seen as much as, and then this is like a producer that isn't, a name, household name. I've seen as low as 500 and as much as 35,000 for an advance. I mean, it's a huge
What are the
range.
circumstances of a $500 advance for a producer on a major label? That's kind of, that strikes me as low.
It's super low. It's typically the lawyer and the artist and the label taking advantage of a young up-and-coming producer who has already either is really eager about the placement and wants to make it work no matter what, and they sense that, or has already agreed to terms in text messages and emails before the producer agreement came out.